as I've gotten older, like I don't know if you guys have experienced this before, where you don't know why you did something at some point in your life, especially like when you're younger, you're just drawn towards something. And then later on with age, wisdom, and sort of like, 2020 perspective from looking back at it, you can say, that's how I got there. And that's why I did that. So for me, probably the way that jiu-jitsu worked is I wanted to fight in MMA because I wrestled and I really liked wrestling, and wrestling was like the first time in high school and in my young youth that I felt like this is where I belong. This is something I'm supposed to be doing. And so it led from that originally. But I think what also led to wrestling was because when I was a young kid, I was, I guess, like 11 or 12 years old. It gets a little fuzzy these days. I'm getting older. I was jumped by some like 16, 17-year-olds that just beat the crap out of me in my neighborhood. And so I remember that left a really bad impression on me, where it felt very physically weak, that sort of thing. And so as a young man, I started searching out ways to, and I didn't know this at the time, but I sort of later on look at it like, it makes complete sense, right? I started searching out ways to empower myself physically. So like this took on weightlifting. I started lifting weights when I was like in seventh grade. I started doing jiu-jitsu or wrestling when I was like, freshman in high school, and then started getting into it from there. And then right afterwards, when I was getting done with high school, I sort of was come to this realization that like, without wrestling, without that sort of bond of dudes coming into a room and beating the crap out of each other, I really didn't like normal life. Just seemed very kind of like boring and not interesting to me. So I wanted to keep that going. And so I was like, well, MMA, I'll do MMA. I'll take this wrestling thing and I'll go do that. And then I got into jiu-jitsu, and then it was like this, I fought MMA. I had, fights, I fought pro, everything else. But at the end of the day, like the grappling, the jiu-jitsu was what I enjoyed most. And so that's how I got there.
Nice. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, obviously getting jumped when you're in like sixth or seventh grade, I'm sure was, could be a bit traumatic, but the way that you responded, you didn't take a victim mentality. You just were like, all right, fuck this. I'm going to hit the weights and get on the mats and make sure that if that moment comes again, you're going to be ready.
Well, I was lucky, right? Like because who knows how it would have happened if it was in, today's culture may have been very different, right? Like hold that card up there. But for me, I was around my friend's dad a lot, and he lifted weights. And so right after I got jumped, he's like, hey, why don't you come downstairs with me? We're in the basement. So me and my buddy would lift weights down in his basement with him, and he like showed me some basic stuff, doing basic 5x5 type stuff. And then in high school, I remember I was just kind of like, at this point, I was a big, chunky, fat kid because, I didn't go outside anymore. Like I was afraid to even just like leave the house myself. And so I didn't really go outside and play anymore. I was just around playing video games. And I remember one of the coaches was like, hey, why don't you come and play football? So I started playing football, whatever. But then I was around a bunch of other dudes who wrestled, and all the really tough football players that we had on our team all wrestled. That was like when they were talking about how tough the wrestling was. They were talking about this, that, whatever. I remember like we would sometimes wrestle around on the football field after practice was over, and like they always could just handle everyone. And so, in my mind, I'm like, I want that, and so I was drawn to it from those people. So I always had good, like, either mentors in the sense of like, just friends or family members, but also just like big brother figures in sports that kind of drew me into a more positive outlet to take that negative situation.
And Chewy, how long, because I heard you say earlier that, and I think we can all relate to this, in hindsight, it's 2020, you looking back to say like, whoa, like I see now why I chose those things. But something we've got into with a lot of high performers, usually people who are performing something physical, some ultra marathoners, some fighters, is that we get into like their fuel source or their why for why they're doing it. And you just kind of described what initially got you in. Did that fuel source, so for you getting jumped when you were 10 or 11, as you got in the sport and you spent, let's say 5, then 10 years, and you started to have the hindsight to look back and see what got you in initially, did that fuel source change, or did you transcend that eventually and say, hey, I'm not doing this because I'm a scared boy anymore. Like I'm doing this now for the love of jiu-jitsu. And was that a conscious thing that happened, or did it kind of just organically work itself out as you spent more time in the sport?
That's a good point. Yeah. when I was younger, there's a lot of fear, right? Everything was fear based. So I was running away from something, right? And whether I was like trying to build myself up, I'm running away from the scared little boy that I used to be. I was running away from a negative experience that was there. Even when I got into business, like back in like when I took the leap in full 2010 to like do this stuff full time, I was running away from being poor, right? I was like, I don't want to be poor, whatever. Eventually, kind of like you were kind of alluding to, it eventually turned into something where it kind of organically worked itself out. I feel like maybe some people can run off that forever, but I feel like at a certain point, like, you know, you have that fear it's a hell of a friggin' fire under your ass, right? Like, I mean, you're going, there's nothing like it, but at the same time, at some point you realize that you're not that person anymore. You know, you're just like, you can't run on fear when like, you're like, what am I going to be afraid of? Like I'm a professional fighter. I can fight people. I'm not a scared little boy anymore. You know, like there's no reason to run with that. And then you have to change the source. So you have to change the fuel source. And so then it became more of, I want to do this because I want to do this and I want to enjoy it. And then that, you know, you have to change that a little bit. And that was a little bit tricky because, you know, again, when you're used to running off of one sort of thing for a long time, when you come to that sort of change in your mindset of who you think you are and your ego is kind of grappling with that, it's a little bit different, but it changed itself organically. I think it was one is like, you know, being introspective enough to realize what's going on and thinking it through, but then also two, then recognizing that you have to kind of let go of some of that stuff, that it's no longer resourceful for you.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We've had a few other, you know, high, you know, caliber athletes on here that it was a similar sentiment. You remember, I think it was Katie,
and then even Derek,
Katie Knight and Derek Wolf, NFL Super Bowl champ. You know, Katie was talking about how, you know, she was using like basically anger in her like ultra running, right? She was just, she ran mad for like 5 years because of a boyfriend, right? And then, you know, Derek, just, you know,
grew up in the,
you know, got a very tough upbringing, was big old defensive lineman, big nasty motherfucker. And he would just played angry, right? Because he brought that kind of that hate into the field, which fortunately for him, you know, I was a linebacker, you know, that works in that sport. You know, you can't be a total idiot, but being mad in the front seven, you know, doesn't hurt that's for sure. But yeah, eventually that source can change. And I think even for me, like I was the youngest. I'm the youngest of three brothers, and they were phenomenal athletes in high school. And then I came in, I was kind of a late bloomer, and they had this like legacy they had created. You know, they were just like all state and everything. And, you know, Matt, you know, blah, 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 blah. Matt was going to play football. And then this little Hanlon rolls in, undersized, 6'1", 130 pounds, soaking wet. You know what I mean? But
now you got to live up to that.
Yeah, exactly. And they're like, oh, that's the third Hanlon. And I, you know, so I stepped into high school with that, and it was super intimidating. So that was my fuel. So I found the weight room and dedicated, you know, so, you know, that was how my journey went. But eventually, you know, by the time I'm, you know, a Division I middle linebacker starting in the middle, you still like, oh, I'm an underdog. And it's like, dude, you're a 240-pound Division I linebacker. You're not an underdog anymore. Like you're past that. But even here with Born Primitive, Tony, like I think we're still underdogs because we never raised money, right? We're competing against these brands that have raised, you know, $50 million from PE firms. And we're still self-funded, like, you know, still scrappy, but eventually, like, we need to transcend that because we are a legitimate fucking company. So it's this weird, you know, that source. It's
just a natural stage. I feel like like when you're in that young stage, you're burning hot, right? I mean, you think about like your youth, you're just, if you think of a season of your life, most of us, like we're full of energy. You know, we have boundless amounts of energy and we're just going hard, right? Like that's what we have. And so I think it's a natural progression for younger people. Like when you have that, like you're going to be in that stage of friggin' just a fire going on. And you've got that fear, that anger, that nervousness, anxiety, because again, you know, the reality is you haven't proven yourself, right? And for all of us, whether we're trying to prove ourselves to the tribe around us or whatever it might be, that's an instinctive thing. They used to have rituals for that back in the day where you have to go prove yourself to be like, you are now part of the tribe as an adult. We don't do that anymore in a sort of controlled setting, but I think that we do it in some setting where everybody's, you know, is their late teenage 20s, that sort of thing. They're trying to get out there and prove themselves. And so I think it's a normal sort of stage for us to go through. You know, I don't think there's for most of us, I don't know that you can just circumvent that you can just say, I'm just going to go and act as if I've already accomplished something. I mean, maybe you could, but it's delusion, right? Act like I've accomplished something and then get rid of all this fear and anxiety out of the gate. Cause I mean, we all go through it.